Hi, and welcome to this course on introducing SQL with SQLite. So databases and SQL are super in-demand skills, and what I want to do in this course is to take you through some of the core features of SQL by using Python and the database SQLite. So this course is intended for someone who has a Python background. You need to know some Python, not that much, but you don't necessarily have much experience with SQL, SQLite, or any other database management system. And the reason I wanted to do this is simply that I see many courses on Postgres, MySQL, or other database systems, but they're somewhat complicated for a beginner who just want to dip their toes into databases. So on some courses on Postgres, for instance, you need to spend the first half hour just setting up stuff, but not with SQLite. So first of all, just to get some terminology clear, we're speaking about database management systems, or DBMS. This is software that helps to create and maintain databases. And most DBMS systems use structured query language, or SQL, or you can also say SQL for this. And this is used for writing and querying data to the database. And as you probably understand based on the context here, what is SQLite? Well, SQLite is actually the most used DBMS in the world. SQLite is, as the name suggests, super lightweight and is included in a lot of stuff, ranging from mobile phones to large applications. One of the things that separates SQLite from other systems like Postgres or MySQL is that it's serverless. That means that there is no intermediate server process, and that makes the whole setup a bit easier. It also means that for big scale applications, you might just want to use SQLite for prototyping, but there are examples of really large projects that are using SQLite. And finally, it's also open source and it's used by a lot of different companies. And you can rest assured that SQLite is a professional product that is very well tested. So kind of the learning outcomes of this course is, first of all, learning some of the core features of the SQL language. This can be learned in any database management system that uses SQL, but specifically here I want to use SQLite. Also, of course, you'll get some practical knowledge with SQLite in particular as a DBMS. Finally, you'll probably also learn some more Python, since we will be writing all of the code in Python. So before closing, I just want to point out that not every DBMS uses SQL. There are other variants and other languages that are used. So here you can see the structure of the course. It will be 8 videos. I've pre-planned this from the beginning, so everything is kind of set in stone when I begin. In the first video, I'll just give this introduction and then we'll start creating a basic table. And then you can see here for the topics that we'll go through quite a lot in these 8 videos. And if you have seen SQL queries before, you can probably recognize some terms here. I don't want to spend time talking about this now because you don't know this yet, and we'll get to it, but this will kind of give you many of the core concepts of the SQL language. Just a disclaimer, you won't be a SQL expert of any kind after 8 videos, but this I think will give you some basis to build further on if you want to. Okay, so let's get started. So here you can see some information about it, and also you can download this and notice now, if you don't already have it installed. Because SQLite is super common to already have installed, and for most distributions of Python, you just get SQLite installed when you have Python. So I think for most of the people viewing this, you don't need to install this from here. You'll already have it installed on your computer. But there are some other nice things here. You can look at the documentation, and you can see also some about section that explains a bit more in detail about what it is and how it separates from other database management systems. Unfortunately, I think this is written in a way that you kind of need to already understand it to understand the text, or at least you need to have some familiarity with other database management systems to understand much of the text you're seeing here. So it says, for instance, that transactions are ACID even if interrupted by system crashes or power failures. And that probably only makes sense to you if you already know what ACID means and what transactions are. I don't think you should spend too much time on this page here, but after the course you can go back and read a bit in the documentation and then hopefully you'll understand much more. Okay, so let's head into the code. So here I am, I've created a folder called SQLite course. I've made 8 files and I'll simply start at the first one here, and this is create table. So what we'll do now is just to import the SQLite library that Python supplies us with and then try and play a bit around. So in Python you have the built-in library SQLite 3. Here you can see it. And the first test you need to do is simply just to save now and then run the file. And this hopefully runs fine. If not, then you need to check your Python installation. But this looks good, so let's continue. And what we're going to do now is to create a connection to the database. So let me just write as a comment, create a connection here. I'll call the connection connection. This is going into the SQLite 3 library and using the connect method. And here now I can specify a name for the database. You'll notice that I don't really have a database yet, and that's completely fine. If it doesn't exist, it'll simply create a new one. Now I want to call this music.db. So in the whole course, I'll work with a specific example, which is about songs from the 80s. And now, if I save this and run it, program runs, that should be fine. And you can also see here that we've gotten a file here. This is called music.db. So when you're using SQLite, the whole database is persisted as a file. So if I go into it, not surprisingly, it's completely empty. So let's go over to the Python script again. And gradually what we want to do is try to create tables within the database. Depending on how much you know from before, a database here contains tables. You can kind of think conceptually in the beginning as tables being like Excel sheets and a database being a collection of them. So maybe like an Excel file. This is a bit simplified and also severely undercutting how powerful databases are, but conceptually I think you can have this in mind in the beginning. So now we've created a connection to this database, but we also need to create a cursor. So we use the SQLite 3 library in Python to communicate with the database, and the implementation here is that first you need a connection and then you need a cursor to execute certain commands. So we can call this cursor. This is pretty standard. And then we go to the connection and we use the cursor method. This gives us this. Of course, these are just Python variables, so you can call it exactly what you want. It's pretty common to call this either connection or just con. And this cursor or just cur, basically the first 3 letters, I think it's easier to just spell it out, so that's fine. And now we can finally insert a table. So our database is completely empty. Let's just create one table in it. And then we need to use the cursor to execute commands. So recall back that this course is really about the language SQL. We're using Python as a kind of interface language here, but we're supposed to be writing SQL commands. And this is where this is happening, because now when we execute commands towards the database, we're writing in this language called SQL. So let me first just write out the statement, then we'll talk a bit about what it means. So the command here is called create table, which, surprise, surprise, creates a table. And then we have this additional if not exists. This is saying that if it doesn't already exist, then I want you to do this. If it does exist, then I don't want you to do anything. The table name is here called songs. So conceptually, what I'm thinking of here is a table. Again, you can think of an Excel sheet where each row represents a new song, and that song will have a name. There will be an artist who created the song will be part of an album, the song will have a release year, and also the song will have a duration, primarily in seconds. So these are the 5 features I want to capture of that song. If you go back to the Excel analogy, these will be the columns here. So you have a column for name, a column for artist, a column for album, one for year and duration, and then each new row in the Excel sheet will represent a new song. Okay, so let's save this and execute it. And everything looks fine. And now your immediate idea is to look into MusicDB and see what has happened. But actually, if I go in here, you'll see this. And this is because this is formatted in a way that is not at all human readable. I don't really want to go into file details here. Kind of the magic of SQLite and other database management systems is that they're supposed to manage, that's the manage in the DBMS word, they're supposed to manage this whole thing. You're not supposed to think about the internal structure too much of the database. What you're supposed to be doing is writing commands for creating things, for fetching them, for updating them, and so on and so on. So even though the MusicDB file will just be lying here, I'll actually just close this because I'll never need to go into it again. The way I'll communicate with the database is through SQL. So it's through commands like this. And that means for now, you'll simply have to trust me that we've created a table and that is now in the database. Of course, soon we'll start to see this for ourselves by actually fetching things, but for now, just trust me, we've made a table. And to see that this is a language and not just some string that we can pass in whatever, let's just delete the word and say create if not exists, save this and run it. And then of course I'll get this error saying, hey, I'll actually get near if syntax error, which is not the most useful feedback. But the problem here is that create if not exist is not really a SQL command. So this will just throw an error and not work. Here I just need to go back and have this statement here. And finally, before we end this first video, what you need to do after you're finished is to close the connection. So we've opened this connection to the database, and this is now kind of laying open. There are some safety mechanisms that will try to close things automatically in some cases, but you're always better off actually making sure that the connection is closed. So an analogy I like to use is that it's like kind of opening a fridge. Here you're opening a fridge, and then you're kind of looking for something to eat, or you're fetching something, or you're putting something into the fridge. This is the interaction with the database. And then finally, you're closing the fridge door. Here we need to close the connection. And this is nothing harder than simply going to the connection object that you had and use the close method. And that's it. So now, if I run this, everything should be fine. We've created a database called MusicDB. We've created a table that is so far empty, and in the next video, we'll continue working on this by inserting actual data into the database.